Hello, it's Monday, August the 7th, 2023, and this is Philip Williams with another Ancient Light podcast. Today, this podcast is going to be a little different from the others. I'm going to address those who have difficulty believing in the account of Noah's ark and flood. You may be Christian, you may be an unbeliever, but have trouble with the account of the flood, even though you might even like to be a believer. So it's not for hostile skeptics, but it's for those of you who have trouble believing in the account of Noah's Ark. Here we see a popular painting of Noah's Ark, and I want you to notice uh, the people, drowned people there by the ark. I'll make reference to that later, but the podcast today is concerns why modern Christians have difficulty believing Noah's Ark and flood, or just moderns in general. Um, but what we moderns ignore. I've I've grouped these into five major reasons that we moderns have trouble believing the account of Noah's flood. Um, the first one is a big one. Modern science has wrongly explained away the true evidence of the flood, and that's been the subject of most of my work, and I'll briefly go over those. The second reason is we confuse the Noah's flood of the Bible with the younger Creationist flood, which is the only popular account of the worldwide flood that's been available today, and that's a difficult to believe, but neither is it does it accord with the biblical account. The third reason is not so good, and that's the fact that we see ourselves as moderns, see ourselves as enlightened, and the Bible as being from credulous, unenlightened pre-moderns. The fourth reason is just our failure to recognize the ongoing presence and providence of the living God. It was not just during the time of the flood that man needed God. And then, last of all, the fifth reason is that we fail to recognize God's the extraordinary supernatural power and wisdom, uh, even in the account of the flood, along with his special revelations that God gives to his servants. Now, uh, going to the first reason, modern science, you really can't believe in modern science and actually believe in Noah's flood, because modern science has taught us a narrative that is contrary to the biblical account. But it's wrong, and it mistakes the geological evidence of the flood as a supposed ice age. And then it doesn't know that much about the ice age theory to understand that the supposed ice age glaciers are physically impossible. Glaciers can't run up mountains and over hills as was required to explain it. And then, very important, and this was my first big insight, it mistakes the archaeological evidence of those flood burials as religious burials, and it's tried to put them off as impossible religious burials. And then the archaeologists and linguists have failed to notice the migrations from the ark. Not well, they have noticed them, but for some reason they haven't connected these migrations with the Noah's Ark. And then everybody believes in scientific dating. I read it like radiocarbon. I do. I use it to date things, but we don't understand that it can also be used, and it is being used, to expand a pre-scientific dating relative chronology that was based on an imagined progressive topology, and the way it functions, it just continues to rate, push back the dates of the first everything, because that's how archaeology depends on um, uh, 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 having something exciting. And my predictions many years ago is that the dates would be pushed back ever towards infinity, and that's what continues to happen. And but most of us, we believe in the historical sciences, but we don't realize that most who work in these sciences are essentially uh, glorified technicians, and really, they teach what they've been taught, and they don't understand the thinking that is giving rise to what they're teaching. And so many of them don't even see or else ignore the numerous contradictions and mysteries. The better archaeologists point these out, or scientists, but most of them don't even notice them. But even addressing them is difficult. Now, I'm not for religious reasons, but when you're challenging um, things, it's a difficult task. In fact, it's not easy to fix the problem without a radical new paradigm. So it's a major problem, and that has been my calling. Then another big reason is the only worldwide flood explanation we've been offered is out of the young Earth creationists, and they've made the flood account unbelievable for somebody really. For example, they can't point to the people who died in the flood, and they say that the flood was so powerful that it just obliterated all human remains. And But somehow or another, those soft dinosaur tissues that the creationists love to talk about, they weren't bothered. It was only human remains, and in fact, they claimed that humans weren't buried because they could outrun the rising floodwaters. And if you, I'm referencing back to the picture of the people outside the ark drowned, and so the theory is that all the corpses of humans died because they could run faster than animals, and so they were able to outrun the flood. But of course, what about the artifacts? What about the houses they lived in? What about the tools and the things they ate with? How did they manage to? I mean, what happened to them? Of course, so there's obviously a serious problem with this account. And they also teach that the flood destroyed and rebuilt the entire Earth's surface many miles deep, like down in the Grand Canyon. The flood both created the canyon or somehow as a result of that. And that contradicts the biblical account, because the biblical account talks about existing places that existed before the flood, like the rivers, Tigris and Euphrates rivers, the lands of Havilah, the lands of Cush. Uh, and then they they now they don't advertise this, but what they give us as flood victims are more than 95% fish. But the account in the Bible doesn't talk. There's nothing about God didn't tell Noah to bring fish on the ark because fish can swim. But the but the younger flood killed just almost entirely fish. Um, and then they tell us, of course, that the Mount Ararat, where the ark, where I visited the ark, didn't exist at the time of the flood, because the mountain sits on top of this earth, the surface is there evidence of the flood. Their real reason for the creation of this young Earth model was to defend a 24-hour creation day reading of Genesis. But Genesis does not literally say that, and the the in fact, the scriptures literally refer to this as God's days, and he and and the scriptures tell us that His time is not our time, uh, and therefore that results in the earth being only a few thousand years old. Now, the creationists are simply using the flood to explain extinct fossils that are deeply buried The flood is the mechanism for doing that. Um, and it's about the age of the earth. They follow modern science essentially. They're not really looking at it. They're still using modern science. They simply compress the time scale. Now, those first two reasons are understandable reasons why people may have and not believe in the flood. This next reason is not a good reason. It's really a very ugly reason. Uh, the modern mind believes that God, that created the world, doesn't know as much about the world as modern science. And the reason is that they think the God of the Bible didn't even know about the world outside the lands of the Bible, so they didn't know about all those animal species living in Australia or the people that were. It was we just don't believe that God really knows what a creator would have to know. Nor do we believe that the world was ever so corrupt and violent as we're given in the account of the flood. But I can assure you that was incredibly violent world that you find in these prehistoric sites of the people who perished in the flood. And then we ourselves as a judge of all things, we don't believe that God would ever judge the earth, even if the people rebelled against him, like it occurred at that time. And even of course, we have difficulty believing all the great miracles of the Bible, such as the parting of the Red Sea and Jonah and the whale. They can't be true because we moderns have never seen such things, and these pre-moderns for sure would know. If God wanted to reveal himself, wouldn't he reveal himself to the world's leaders and to their expert advisors, who, of course, include scientists? Surely he would not have shown himself to pre-moderns who were credulous as small children. So uh, we look down. Unfortunately, now knowledge, if we really had knowledge, the more knowledge we have, the more humble we become. But for some reason, we have become arrogant, and I'll include myself in among those who are like that. But another thing is another reason for this is you probably never thought about this reason I'm going to give you, that we ignore that God is continuously active in the earth. For the life, the growth, the protection of the wildlife, the plants, the animals, and all the people of the earth. Let's just go to the Beatitudes, which most of you will remember. He talks about the lilies of the field and how beautiful they are. But God clothes them. God is really tending nature. Um, Again, he talks about the ravens, and he talks about God feeds them. And it's not that God created a world where they have food, but he's actually involved in feeding them. And so that's Jesus used as an example, him being concerned about us. And of course, even if we don't believe and we're not good, he's still that good a God. He still sends his rain on the wicked or the bad people and the good people. Uh, God is love. Uh, but now here's something that the modern mind needs to understand. Man can never create life because life is spirit, and freedom comes from spirit and life. So the only thing we can do are things that are dead things, or we can see the patterns of living things. We can observe them and notice them. But there are things about nature that man really, the weather, it's still unpredictable. We can see, we now can see long range and notice trends in that, uh, but the something's controlling the weather, and the scriptures show that God's very much involved in the weather and the climate. That's one of my points from the very beginning. And so, if we believe in God at all, we have to believe in this. And the very important, the life on earth requires his continuous presence and supervision. Someone has described modern Christianity as mostly moralistic therapeutic deism. Now, in deism, they believe that God created things, but that God's not actively involved with his presence in doing things. Um, now, I'm just going to use an example of climate change. I'm not addressing the science of climate change here, uh, even though I've been working on climate change for about 20 or 30 years, and I know a lot about glaciers and sea level rises, what causes the, the difference in the dangers. But uh, we moderns, we believe in science, and science, they're in almost unanimous agreement, except some crazy skeptics, right, about climate change. So okay, let's just accept climate change here, man-made climate change. But still, regardless, God, far more than man, has always been caring for the animals, for the earth, and for the bad and the good, as we've just seen. And in the flood, even when something greatly impacts climate, God is continually adjusting things to preserve us. So, in fact, the truth of the matter is when you realize how how many things have to go right for us to survive for another week, the more you study the world, you can see all these dangers, and you can imagine, and so you can, but address it. If man is causing the climate change, we're not wise enough, or do we have the ability to fix it? Uh, the other thing, though, is that most of the concerns we hear about climate change concern wildlife rather than human beings. In fact, they tell us that one of the problems is that humans are really the problem with the earth. Uh, and here's the part that really concerns me. Because uh, the poor is something that I've worked with, and I see that, and I know that all the solutions to climate change greatly disadvantage the poor. The poor pay more for gasoline for their utilities. That's a big part of their income. For the affluent, they don't even notice that. In fact, affluent probably don't notice the poor. Now they are aware that these undeveloped countries won't want to develop, and that's a danger, but uh, but really, I'm talking even if we just take the domestic, the all the solutions are hurting the poor, and we better remember that um, the God of the Bible is the Father of the poor, and maybe we need to read our Bibles again, and he's their protector. Um, Now, the fifth reason is much more positive, and that is the fact that we fail to recognize God's great power and wisdom and his special revelation to his servants. Um, Now, I want to go over the biblical account of Noah's Ark and the flood and show how it combines the natural. It doesn't ignore the natural or the ordinary and the scientific, but it also combines it with the supernatural, the extraordinary or miraculous. And I'm going to use the red to point out the supernatural part. One of the problems is that many bad defenses of the flood have tried to explain the flood using natural causes. And you're just almost completely ignoring the account of the flood. And in fact, most criticisms of the account, they try to explain this, put the problem with Noah rather than God, and they completely ignore the supernatural elements. Now let's look at these about 16 of these elements of the account of the flood. Now, floods we know drown humans and land animals. That's why the flood God sent the flood, and you need some way to protect people from drowning. So a ship that's a natural thing. Uh, uh, the accounts in the Bible do recognize the natural laws. Now to build an ark, another flood was coming, and Noah had to be informed. Now that required a supernatural revelation. And if you don't believe that God communicates to His servants, you're just rejecting uh, rejecting the Bible. Uh, then just the size of the ark. Uh, it had to be large enough to feed all the animals, but Noah wouldn't have known how many animal species, how big. But the creator, the big zookeeper, he knew. So he gave the dimensions of the ark to Noah, and it had to be designed in such a way as to house and care for the animals. And the more I've studied this ark and actually seen some of the actual constructions of what I've witnessed and what others associated with me have witnessed, it's just a marvelous design. Um, but no ship like this had ever been, even if Noah was um, experienced at shipbuilding. No ship like this had ever been built, and because of what it was going to have to, so it obviously needed a supernatural knowledge to be able to do this. And of course, the account requires that each species of animal had to be brought to the ark. And that would have been impossible for Noah to do. But the account doesn't say that Noah did it. It says the same God who had been looks after these animals all along, and he's involved in the migrations and the weather. But he knew, and he knew what he wanted to do, and he knew how to bring them and make sure they got safely to the ark. And now this is something really important. They had to be in the ark just prior to the beginning of the flood. If they got there too soon, they would be eating all the food that's going to be needed for this more than a year on the ark. Um, and of course, a a new source of water. The earth wasn't flooding before that, but there was a source of water, and the scriptures tell us that there was an extraordinary source of water was introduced, and I can show you the evidence of the that the earth was about 5,000 years ago. There was a different kind of watering system, and we had rivers and people living in the deserts of Arabia and Sahara, and we had elephants living up in the Arctic regions. But something vastly changed about 5,000 years ago. Um, Now, continue with these natural considerations. Just launching the ark, uh, these when these when I see the great rocks were removed and displaced, now they say that ice age moved these rocks, but the water that came out of these things would have just destroyed the ark. So the ark had to be in a place where it wouldn't have been destroyed by that, where it could be just gradually lifted. And the scriptures do say that the Lord uh, protected the ark. Now, drowning, make sure that everything as God intended was drowned. The flood had to cover the mountaintops, higher than a giraffe could reach. We could look at it that way. That's a natural consideration, but the account does say that that actually happened. Now, because the food in the ark wasn't unlimited, it needed to go rest on a high mountain so the ground could dry out and new vegetation could appear while the water still draining from the rest of the world. And I've seen the picture from that place up on Mount Ararat, and that's precisely what happened. But God had to put it right on the top of the mountain in such a place that it would give the ground that's right around it time for new vegetation. Um, and it's a supernatural fact that the earth had to be made inhabitable again after the flood. The watering system now that watered the earth prior to that is now gone. So, but the scriptures talk about uh, what what gives us the rain system. We get a rainbow after the flood, and that comes from the seasons, the cold and now the air comes up, the moisture comes up in the tropics and goes over the desert belts, north and south of the equator, and then gets to the temperate regions of the earth and drops. But that had to be created. So so God's supervision is involved after that. And then, of course, Noah had to be aware when it was land had vegetation, and the first thing he sent out was a raven, and the raven could eat carrion, the bodies of dead animals, and so the raven stayed out there and continued to eat. But after that, he sent the dove out, and the first time the dove couldn't find anything to eat, so he came back where he got his food. He came back to the ark. Uh, then the third, well, when he sent out the dove the second time, it came back, but it had an olive branch in its land, and there was obviously vegetation occurring then. So was that natural or supernatural? Well, it's a little bit both, but mostly just a clever way of checking. But of course, now I've already mentioned this, God had to adapt the climate to the new conditions, and then the animals um, had to be properly disembarked. Now, if Noah had released the fox with those two rabbits, we wouldn't have any rabbits. So the rabbits had to be released first, and of course they populate pretty rapidly, if you know anything about rabbits, and they had then the same thing with all the carnivores, and there were of course many dangers and obstacles that the animals faced, but the same God who always had looked after them, is looking after them today, was looking after them and made sure that they could get their habitats. Um, Now, I there's a lot of way. When I was studying this, I realized that the flood created these giant floating islands, and that was a good mechanism. Therefore, in South America, for example, we have mostly climbing animals or native animals, but God have all kind of ways to accomplish. He knows how to get things done. Now, adapting to the various species as animals went to became genetically isolated, and Charles Darwin observed these things. That could have been natural, but I really believe that even in these genetic adaptations, that God is actually involved in that. But if we allow that to be just a purely natural conditions, we see that 13 of the 16 considerations we have considered have these supernatural elements, and so yeah, the flood was a no question it was a supernatural event. In fact, uh, someone said, I'll tell you who it said, of all the miracles in the Bible, Noah's flood is the most difficult to believe. Now, that is a quote from Voltaire, who was the father of the Enlightenment. And now, Voltaire believed in a deistic God, but he didn't believe in the God of the Bible. He didn't believe in miracles. Uh, uh, he's the one that we haven't seen miracles that he followed Hume or Hume followed him, or if we haven't seen it, it didn't exist. If this animal is not in our zoo, it doesn't exist. So that's part of the modern arrogance. But I was influenced by another um, statement that mankind can never comprehend God's greatness and power. I learned that from my father, from my late father, who did have an encounter with God, and he wouldn't say a lot about it, but the thing he just said over and over when I was a child and I was asking these questions about Noah's flood and everything, he didn't understand that. He couldn't answer the questions, but he said, "You don't understand the power and the greatness of God." Now, I'll leave you this with my own statement that if our world doesn't have a God like that of Noah, who can gather us as he gathered the animals, none of us have a prayer of escape and what's soon and quickly coming upon us. I won't get into that, but I would like for you to share this this podcast with your friends. Thank you.